In Alberta, we have a totally public, socialized healthcare system. The government controls all the doctors, controls all the nurses, controls the healthcare system. What I discovered was fundamentally a Marxist treatise that talked about social justice and health equity, trying to achieve social ends through administration of the healthcare system. Nobody is in exactly the same state of health. And so consequently, it seems obvious that we're all in different states of vulnerability to a virus like COVID-19. Well, what we were told constantly by people like Dr. Hinshaw is that the virus doesn't discriminate. Well, this is fundamentally a lie. In fact, it's totally illogical. In a free society, your outcomes are largely determined by your choices. But according to these people, our choices don't matter. We're all the same. We all have the exact same vulnerability to this virus, regardless of how healthy we are, regardless of how old we are, regardless of where we're from. And that is how the socialist ethic is applied.
Canadian authorities have cracked down on several churches, despite no scientific evidence showing that church gatherings are dangerously spreading the virus.
We were taken to court in January. The court ordered us to comply. If we didn't submit, AHS could take us back to court and hold us in contempt of court, and that comes with up to 2 years in prison.
You're living under oppression at this point, and so every day you're waking up thinking, is the government, what are they going to do? Are they going to show up at our door? Are they going to take our kids? Are they going to take our home?
We were going to be opening in contempt of court on Sunday. I sensed the need to preach to the issue at hand.
But there is absolutely no way to be a faithful Christian without being vitally connected to a local church. Many of the imperatives of the New Testament require belonging to a local body of believers. It is impossible to be obedient to Christ and not be active in the local church.
Tim Stevens had said to me in a text, "You're the most hated man in Alberta right now."
The media gets a hold of this and they try to use their power of public shame to put the pressure on.
We got this text, and it was a video. It was one of our congregants in their home with like their camera on.
Health orders. AHS found the Grace Life Church of Edmonton in violation of the province's COVID restrictions after worshipers were witnessed not wearing masks.
Videoing what they're seeing on the 6 o'clock news, and it climaxes in this statement where, who's the head of the church?
So who is the head of the church? Not Caesar.
You know, is it Jason Kenney?
Not Jason Kenney.
Is it Dina Hinshaw?
Not Dina Hinshaw.
Is it the elders?
Not the lead pastor. Not the elders. The Lord Jesus Christ.
And we were just like, what? I mean, it was epic, and it just put wind in our sail. And if this was going to be an opportunity for the glory of Christ to be on display and his lordship to be heralded, then we were all in.
I keep hearing them say over and over, the Lord commands us to meet. The Lord commands us to meet. He does not.
God requires us to meet. The very nature of who we are, the ecclesia, we are a gathered people.
There were quite a number of faithful Christians who refused to sit under Episcopalian ministers whom they believed had compromised the gospel and denied the headship of Jesus Christ. They were gatherings of believers, young and old. They would walk miles through nature and they would meet in all kinds of weather. You know, the southwest of Scotland can be very wet and very windy, and the ground would be very boggy. And they had these heavy plaid shawls and clothes that just would drink in the rain, and they'd be sodden through. They would go out into the moors, into the heathlands, into the hills. They would try to find little ravines where they would be secluded from the government forces, the dragoons, the army platoons that were on the lookout for non-conformists. And so young and old would gather for worship and they would sing psalms. Inevitably, almost always, some were caught. It was a serious crime, fines, and even the death penalty. Hebrews 10 verse 25. Do not forsake the assembling together of yourselves, as some have done, even though it may cost you to do so.
One of the most common responses we heard, by meeting, you become contributors to the spread of the virus, and spreading a virus is something that's not loving.
The penalties are, you might be killing your granddad. The World Health Organization had proclaimed an extraordinarily high fatality rate, infection fatality rate, and that was frightening. I started reading about this and understood that their calculation of the infection fatality rate was grossly wrong, and anyone who knew anything about medical science knew that pretty much right away. And that's because that number is a fraction, and that top number in the fraction is the number of people who die. The bottom number is the number of people who are infected. When you take that fraction, and they calculated it to be 3.4%, it ignored two things. Number one, it ignored the data. The first real data was the Japanese cruise ship that showed an infection fatality rate of much less than that. We know that respiratory viruses typically have a lot of people who are infected, but they're not sick or not sick enough to go see a doctor. You can imagine that there's a lot of people who are infected that are undetected. And so you are overestimating the fraction. You're saying if 5 people died and 100 people were sick enough to go to see the doctor, but 10,000 people were actually infected, the infection fatality rate is 5 divided by 10,000, not 5 divided by the 100 who were sick enough to go see a doctor.
So that is a grim milestone, is it not, for Italy?
2 new grim forecasts. FEMA reporting deaths up nearly 30% from last week.
3.4% mortality.
I wrote a document called the Great Barrington Declaration, aimed at the general public, not a scientific audience, to let them know that there were prominent scientists that disagreed with the lockdown policy. The main thing about the declaration is that it reflected a century of experience with respiratory viral pandemics. It let people know, no, the scientific evidence doesn't point to lockdowns. There is another way. This idea was that of focused protection of vulnerable older people, lifting lockdowns.
I am a public health professional with 27 years of experience. I have served during the HIV/AIDS epidemic. I've served in H1N1. I've served in the original SARS. I served in the anthrax outbreak. I've served in West Nile virus, monkeypox, Ebola, CCHF. Never in my life have I believed I was in the twilight zone until what I started to see happening and the pandemic was happening. When you step out of your door every day, as long as you're not pushed, you are accepting a certain level of risk. When you decide to drive, unless you're being forced to drive, you're accepting a certain level of risk.
We can make a very simple analogy here. Almost all car accident deaths are on high-speed roads. Why don't we make all speed limits 5 miles per hour? We would never have a fatal car accident again.
As long as people were not being forced to gather in church, and they were given the right to choose what was best for themselves and their families, they've taken a look at COVID, they've taken a look at their circumstances, they've taken a look at the environment, and they've decided that what is best for them, spiritual connection, spiritual health, far outweighs the overall risk that COVID presents.
He was my mentor, so I'm going to have to let him speak.
The small print here, it's really small print. In states with evidence of community transmission, bars, restaurants, food courts, gyms, and other indoor and outdoor venues where groups of people congregate should be closed.
We had a meeting, and Dr. Birx looked across the table and said, I just want to make one thing clear, Scott. No one on the task force is for a lockdown. I said, oh, really? Are you for business restrictions and closures? Yes. Are you for school closures? Yes. Are you for testing and quarantining asymptomatic positive tested people? Yes. Are you for limiting group sizes? Yes. Are you for stopping families from congregating? Yes. I said, then you're for lockdowns. That's what lockdowns are.
Lockdowns had little to no effect on COVID mortality rates.
70% of the spread occurred within households. Only 1% occurred on subways or transportation.
Political unrest and a rise in domestic violence were just some of the more devastating effects lockdowns had on society.
Anxiety disorder, depression skyrocketing during 2020 compared to the pre-pandemic 2019. We saw suicide attempts in teenage girls skyrocketing during the lockdowns. And we saw drug abuse, substance abuse skyrocketing during the lockdowns. We saw double to triple self-harm visits to doctors from teenagers in the United States during the isolation of 2020 compared to the previous year. What do we mean by self-harm visits? We mean teenagers putting out cigarettes on their skin, slashing their wrists.
The American public health response is the single worst public health mistake in peacetime history, and it's not close.
It was a late afternoon in the White House. I looked at my email, and I had an email from a woman who had been emailing me several times and saying, oh, Dr. Atlas, everything you're saying is right. Keep speaking. I just want to tell you, my husband committed suicide this week because of the lockdowns. And then the same afternoon, I had an email saying, a different person, this is a couple hours later, you know, my daughter tried to kill herself today. You're the reason I'm telling her to live, people like you. So, you know, these people that think that I'm going to stop talking and saying the truth, about the harms of the lockdowns and the really heinous problem of this policy because of their impotent criticism and letters from people like Stanford University medical school professors. They have no idea who they're dealing with here.
People have been very concerned to make sure people's physical lives are protected, in the process shut down places where there's hope for their spiritual lives.
By canceling church, you're not loving your neighbor. The real offense here is to remove the spiritual help and testimony that the church gathered represents.
You're interrupting a worship service. And so at this point, we can't let you in the building.
And actually, we're not. Because in order to interrupt a service, you have to actually do something to interrupt it.
But your presence does interrupt it.
You're
intimidating women and children.
And that can be debated in court.
Yeah, it
we are
absolutely
entering,
will
so,
be.
yeah.
And when Grace Life Church did not force its congregants to wear masks during service, the church was put under weekly surveillance by local police and Alberta Health Services inspectors.
I mean, you can tell me, was anything in compliance with what we issued in the order?
We haven't made, I don't think, any material changes since that order.
Okay, and no cap on occupancy for 15%?
No. We still don't think you should be coming into our facility, that it is a disturbance. I contacted my lawyer. I asked him, so what are the odds of me doing jail time for this? And at that point, I thought it was a pretty meager possibility, thinking to myself that they likely didn't want to put a pastor in jail. And he said, it's pretty likely. And I said, yeah? He's like, yeah, pretty likely.
He came downstairs for lunch and he told me that the likelihood of jail time was a possibility and a very good possibility. And so I kind of sat there. I didn't really say anything. I didn't want to add a burden to him. And so he went upstairs after lunch. I cleaned up all the dishes. I went into the bathroom and I cried.
The physiological impact of it on my body was significant. I had a migraine brewing, felt the weight of the world on my shoulders, was kind of pacing and almost having a difficult time even being on my own feet. I lay down and just, prayed it out and wrestled with the Lord on it. In his mercy and grace, I came out of that time resolved. What do we do to inform the government of their role? And that question was on my mind that week. And I sensed the need to speak to government and to the role of government. This was another sermon where you're not cracking commentaries. Your theology, your life is just gonna come out in one sermon.
What is the God-ordained role of government? And can we even ask that question? When the government forbids what God commands, for example, forbidding the preaching of his word, can't comply with that.
This church near Edmonton has repeatedly violated public health orders.
When the government commands what isn't theirs to command, for example, the terms of worship for a local church, can't comply with that.
Grace Life Church had to turn people away Sunday as they were busier than ever and over fire code capacity. The church has been ignoring a closure order since January.
I knew following that service that they were gonna want me to turn myself in. I turned myself in on Tuesday. They wanted to imprison me. I was a menace to society, and they deemed my imprisonment necessary for the protection of society. And the Crown said he needs to be released with a condition. It was ordering me to comply with the Public Health Act, and I indicated that I couldn't do that. Had I signed, then in some way I'd be admitting or agreeing to comply with that order. And so now I'm actually being constrained, I'm now in custody.
Pastor of a church in the Edmonton area is under arrest for violating public health orders.
Pastor James Coates was arrested and sent to prison a couple of weeks ago in Canada. What did he do? He held a church service.
You're gonna go into quarantine for 2 weeks, so where do you wanna go after that? Do you wanna go to general public, general population, or do you wanna go to where they keep the rapists and pedophiles?
One particular pastor, Pastor James Coates, up in the Edmonton area, Alberta, Canada, who sits in maximum security prison at this time because he refused to follow the authorities' mandate not to preach, not to enter his church. They told him essentially what was told John Bunyan. Anytime you want to stop preaching, we'll let you out. He said, I can't do that, so he's still there.
Bunyan would come up to London from time to time and preach. Bunyan had this ability to preach to ordinary men and women. John Bunyan then was arrested and taken to jail. Once Bunyan was convinced about something, there was no shifting him. It was not possible. And so he ended up then, well, officially he was in jail for the next 12 years. As you can imagine, some of those prisons were pretty horrible places. And so sometimes men died in prison. He could have left the jail at any point he chose, but he would not be allowed to preach. Now, some people would argue, well, just go, Bunyan, and preach quietly, or preach where nobody can find you, but I don't think that's the way John Bunyan's conscience worked. He wasn't able to do that.
The government has always done this, I think, throughout history. You aim at the cream, the leading preachers, if you can get them either to conform or so crush them in spirit that people lose heart.
August 14th until September 4th, we had 4 or 5 emergency hearings.
The level of aggression that I saw that was leveled against Pastor MacArthur and Grace Community Church was somewhat unparalleled.
LA County kept coming back and saying, we are not satisfied, we're not satisfied.
A law firm they hired were real bulldogs. It was completely dominating the practice. It was an all-out war.
We were so busy, and we were literally in court probably every week, multiple times a week. Leading up into that, we had been winning.
So they wanted to force him to stop having church services.
This was the bigger hearing for a preliminary injunction.
They were going into court to have him held in contempt, which would be much bigger fines and potentially a jail sentence.
It was Judge Beckloff, and it was his opportunity to make a ruling. And so at the end of the hearing, the judge didn't really give us much of a tell. When I received the order, I was pretty crushed. There were certain places where I wondered, did I mess up? And other places where I was like, no, he understood exactly what I was saying. He just said, you lose.
Now there was a preliminary injunction that said that the church could not meet and could not hold indoor worship services. And so when I called Pastor John, it was definitely not good news.
So we are beginning to see persecution from government. This is the most formidable persecution.
There were people inside the government that contacted me and said, look, we know who you are. We know what you're doing. You understand there's a chance you'll be arrested, right? And I said, no. You're fairly prominent in your profession, and we can change that. There were people, friendly and unfriendly, warned me, you might want to sever your ties with Grace Community Church because it's not going to end well for you.
The government has obviously turned up the heat on churches, trying to discourage them from gathering together.
They call us the fringe minority. From the last 2 years, 6 people in Edmonton, the Covd cabinet, have ruled our country. They have determined the livelihoods and the lives of 4.5 million people.
A pastor who gathers for church outside is being arrested.
Yeah.
When laws are unjust, then it's incumbent upon those who are righteous to stand up and say no.
We have one of the best systems in the world. Even God said, give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, right? So we're not going to get into this philosophical
debate. And the gathering of the church is not Caesar's.
Bye, Daddy! And when you say that there's an opportunity to go through the legal means, we're 15, 16 months into this, and they have yet to provide anything in court. That's not like a delayed access to justice is not just at all. Yeah.
The government's taking control. They want to take control of absolutely everything. The church has become the main enemy of the government. Nothing new. Scottish Covenanters. Amazing people. 1660, the Covenanters signed their national covenant with their blood. They were determined, quoting, to resist to the death the claims of the king, to override the crown rights of the Redeemer in his church, King Jesus.
The Grassmarket Memorial is commemorating not just the men executed at the Grassmarket, but it represents a memorial to the wider cause of, really today, you would call it freedom of conscience, certainly religious freedom, and to commemorate a dark time in Scotland's history when governmental authority under the oversight of the king sought to stamp out any trace of resistance to his royal kingly authority. The gallows were set high because the government wanted to impress on people, look what happens when you defy the edicts of the king. They would be given one last opportunity to abjure the covenants and accept the rightful legal authority, as it was said, of the king. Difficult to know how many were actually executed. They represented a time in Scotland when to be a faithful Christian could quite possibly mean you face death all the day long.